Hello and welcome to my Stamina Dragonknight guide for the Deadlands DLC. In this video I will cover the basics of the class, followed by general stuff like Mando Stones or race choice, and then move on to 5 different parse setups and end the video by quickly covering trash, dungeon and arena setups. I also provide some in-game footage for the meta setup in action and example clips for the trash setups. I will also show how the Stamina Dragonknight can look like in Maelstrom arena, even though this is from last patch, but yeah, not much change there, so you still get the idea. I won't cover different meta gear options, since that depends on what you have access to and what you want to achieve with like the content you run and the people you run with. However, if you need more information, you will see what I used after the parses. And if that's not enough, you can check, for example, Skinny Cheek's videos. He did a nice breakdown of monster sets and 5-piece sets. So yeah, make sure to check those out. If you still have some questions about the gear or something else, please don't hesitate and feel free to ask in the comments. Okay, with that being said, let's start. The Dragonknight is a mainly melee focused class, which means that most of your main abilities like Whip, Claw or Breath are pretty close range, and even though you have stuff like Flames of Oblivion or Stone Giant, which are kinda ranged, most of your time will be melee. They also take advantage of the poison and burning status effects, since they have the increased damage for both of those, and get sustain whenever they are applied. They have a kind of well-balanced mix between direct damage and damage over time effect, which makes them pretty nice for sustained fights. That means that they don't have some insane burst window, but they keep pretty constant damage over longer durations. Dragonknight rotations can be considered fairly easy, since they don't require a minigame like Nightblade Bowproc or Necro Blastbones every 2 casts, but you can still play around a bit with your Seething Fury stacks and get a little bit more damage going. Let's move on to the important passives and skills. The probably most iconic class passive of the DK is the Combustion passive. That passive will give us access to the previous mentioned increased burning and poison damage, and also the sustain health. It has a 1-second cooldown since Deadlands, which is fine, since you don't really proc those status effects more often than that, but the damage will always be increased, so there's no cooldown on that one. Searing Heat is a kinda boring passive, since it just increases your skill duration, but yeah, that's why you want it. Word and Ruin is kinda nice, since it simply increases your flame and poison damage, but sadly Stam Decay does not have that much poison. But yeah, I take it. Eternal Mountain is once again just skill duration, in this case for your Earth and Heart abilities. Battle Roar is the second sustained passive and restores resources after using an ultimate, depending on the amount of points spent. Note, since Deadlands it's points spent, not ult cost. So using an ultimate while having 400 ultimates stored, it restores more than having only 250 ultimates stored. Mountain's Blessing is quite bad if you don't use Stone Giant, since it generates ultimate whenever you cast an Earth and Heart ability, and sadly most Earth and Heart abilities are either bad for PvE DPS or not casted often enough to get a lot of ult out of it. But it also provides the minor brutality buff, and this is a pretty nice one. Helping Hands is in theory also a sustained passive, but it's pretty useless unless you cast Eruption, and even then it's not a huge stamina gain, but yeah, I'll take it. Moving to the important skills. Starting with the most iconic one, Standard of Might. This is probably the strongest ultimate in the game if you just consider your own personal damage. And it has a huge freaking hitbox and does great damage on its own, but also increases your damage done by 15% if you stand inside the affected area, which will cause you to have some nice damage windows while that ultimate is up. Sadly, if you can't use it, you will notice it, or like if you can't get the full duration out of it, you will notice your damage is affected, since that ultimate is really a huge part of your total damage done. Venomous Claw is a pretty nice single target damage over time ability that procs poison status on the initial hit, and the damage of the ability ramps up the longer it lasts, so make sure to not recast it before it run out, to make sure you get that last strong damage tick. Noxious Breath is a pretty decent AoE damage ability, which applies Major Breach to your enemy's hit. Unfortunately, Major Breach is kinda useless in group PvE, since for important target you either have it applied from your tanks, or from Necro Boneyards, or whatever, but yeah, it is pretty decent damage still, and in combination with Whip, it provides you a stack of Seething Fury. Speaking of Seething Fury, godlike transition, Molten Whip is a very strong spammable, which also gains you the stacking mechanism of Seething Fury, which means that while Whip is slotted, you gain a stack of Seething Fury after casting an Ardent Flame ability. This stacks up to 3 times, gaining you weapon and spell damage for each stack, and increasing your damage of the next Molten Whip cast for each stack. So obviously casting Molten Whip does not give you a stack. Flames of Oblivion is a very strong ability, which is kinda simple since it just deals damage. But yeah, if you cast it, you will have some orb floating around you, which will automatically shoot once on the initial cast, and then once after every 5 seconds for 15 seconds. So on cast, 5 seconds after, 10 seconds after, and 15 seconds after. So 4 damage instances in total. Stone Giant is an ability that is not very liked by most people. However, it still applies a very desired debuff on the enemy, which is named Stagger. Stagger is a debuff that increases the damage taken by every single damage instance, so if an enemy is hit by a dot tick, a light attack, a bash, and whatever, all separate damage ticks get a fixed damage value increase for each stack of Stagger, which also stacks up to 3 times. And I also mentioned Eruption, since it's a pretty decent filler ability. It has long duration, decent damage, a decent radius. So yeah, it is not great, but it's nice to have. And now let's quickly cover the more general stuff, which is Mundostone. For group content you most likely run the Thief, but for solo content you can do the Shadow if you do some acuity build stuff, or the Lava if you need the penetration. That depends on what you want to do and what you have access to, what your build looks like, and so on. Races, the best is Dunmer in terms of utility and damage, but you also have very strong options with Khajiit and Orc. The damage between all those 3 is pretty similar, but then you also have Red Guard if you want more sustain, or Imperial if you want more sustain and a bit of tankiness. But yeah, all those choices are pretty decent, and you won't break anything if you choose to not pick the best in slots damage race. Food wise, if you run a whip setup, you can use the green stam food, which is 6k flat max stam, so the highest potential damage you can get from food. Or you run Bystat if you need health, or max stam and stam rec if you need a bit of stam recovery, obviously. But yeah, that depends on what your setup and your group comp looks like. Potions is just a simple choice of weapon power pots, or depending on how your groups and bars are set up, you can probably consider heroism pots as well, but yeah, either of those two. Champion points. If you are trying to reach the new introduced crit damage cap, you would try to prioritize Backstabber and or Fighting Finesse. Always, if you can flank, Backstabber is better than Fighting Finesse, if not, Fighting Finesse. If you, for example, only need one of those, like let's say you can't flank, but you need one passive, so you use Fighting Finesse, then the priority of the other champion points are Master Rams, Deadly Aim, and Thaumaturge. Let's start with the first setup, the meta setup. In this setup we will use the Molten Whip as our spammable, and since Deadlands it scales off your highest stats, like Flames of Oblivion, but it will still cost Magicka. We do run Black Rose Dual Wield on our front bar with one Nirn and one Charge trait, and add a Poison and Flame Glyph to it. And since the Charge trait got a huge buff, we will proc a lot of status effects including Burning, which will give us Magicka back thanks to the Combustion passive. After the pass, I will add some in-game footage of the setup so you can see that it actually works in content as well. In this case it's me in a Magicka group, so we have Worm as Magicka support. On our backbar we do run a Maelstrom Greatsword, Reliquant 5-piece on our body, Harpooners Waiting Killed as Mythic, and a strong mod set of our choice. Yes, we only run one 5-piece set. The setup looks a bit like we tried to swap gear and failed, but it's actually very nice, since we combine a lot of small, strong set bonuses. Important notes. Make sure to play around with your Seething Fury stacks a bit, so you don't cast, for example, a Noxious Breath while we are at 3 stacks of Whip, so you cast Whip first, and then use Venom Claw or Noxious Breath. Try to not lose your calf stacks, since the 3 stacks is very nice damage, and you will lose more by letting those drop, instead of, for example, have 2 seconds downtime on Noxious Breath. Maintain Stampede, as it is your backbar glyph and backbar weapon proc. Rotation. The rotation is, as always, fully dynamic, but we can always start the same way. In my case, I pre-buff with 3 times Flames of Oblivion and Barb Trap. Then I begin with Stampede, Standard, Cloak, 3-stack Whip, Calf, Breath, Claw, Rending. Usually you would now want to use Standard, but the timings of the dummy are a bit off, so I prefer to use the Standard a bit earlier. After that, just reapply our dots as they run out. If our dots are running, spam. Skill priority. Calf stacks, Stampede, Cloak, Foe, Trap, Claw, Breath, Rending. Continue with that till the end, since we don't have an Execute skill, and no, Whirling Blades is a shit skill, and Executioner is not worth on our backbar, since our backbar stats are too low. Molten Whip is just on the backbar to get the Seething Fury stacks. Second setup, Vateshran dual wield. In this setup, we build around the dual wield of Vateshran Arena. Those are pretty good since their release, and this is still the case. We basically have the same gear setup as in the meta setup, we just replace our arena weapon and some skills. We also add Stone Giant to the rotation to have a cheaper semi-spammable, since Hidden Blade is expensive as hell. You can play around with your skills a bit and maybe replace Stone Giant and Noxious Breath with Cloak and Consuming Trap or something like that, but this is what I came up with. Important notes. You need to be exactly behind the enemy. Unlike classic flanking from, for example, Backstabber with a range of 270 degrees, we only have 90 degrees here. Hidden Blades is stronger than Stone Giant at roughly 80% boss HP, so start using it then. On a Parse, you want to drop Stone Giant at roughly 30 to 25%, but in a raid, if you're the only one providing it, you want to keep it till the end. Eruption is a strong AoE Magicka costing dot that scales with max stats, so the damage is lower than usually, but it's still very nice damage per cast and restores a bit of stamina thanks to the Helping Hands passive. Rotation. The rotation is, as always, fully dynamic, but we can start the same way, 3 times Flames of Oblivion, 1 Barb Trap, and then begin with Stampede, Carve, Stone Giant, Claw, Eruption, Breath, Standard, and 2 times Stone Giant. After that, we reapply all dots as they run out. If all dots are running, spam. Skill priority, Stone Giant for the stagger debuff, Stampede, Foe, Cloak, Trap, Claw, Breath, Eruption. Again, use Hidden Blades at roughly 80%, stop casting Stone Giant and Eruption at around about 25%. Molten Whip is just for the passive weapon damage multiplier. Maelstrom dual wield. It's been pretty strong a long time ago, like Scalebreaker I think, but it was never really useless after. However, it is still far from meta, since the damage is simply lower and the gameplay is not as flexible, since you need a lot of single target damage over time effects to make benefit of that set. Same concept in terms of gear, we just replace our front bar accordingly. You could also fit Stone Giant in that rotation, but especially in combination with Carve and the Maelstrom dual wield buff, it is the hell on earth to play that rotation, so I'd not recommend to torture yourself. Important notes. This set only buffs damage over time effects that are always on your enemy, no matter if you or they move, kinda like Zen, so Poison Status, Venom Claw, Rending Slashes, Noxious Breath Dot, and so on. You can either use Bloodthirst or Rapid Strikes, because they are roughly the same damage, so decide what you prefer. Bloodthirst heals you and procs a lot of hemorrhage, while Rapid Strikes is a bit more damage on its own. Obviously, make sure to cast Flurry before you use any single target damage over time to make sure you get that buff from the set. You don't drop any skills, so you just continue with your rotation till the end, to like 3% boss HP or something, and then you just spam him to death. Dots from your back bar are also affected from the buff, as long as it's running while you cast it. Rotation. Rotation, once again, fully dynamic. Pre-buff with 3 times Foe, 1 Barb Trap. Begin with Stampede, Carve, Flurry, Claw, Breath, Carve, Standard, Flurry again, Rending, Consuming. After that, just reapply all dots as they run out. If all are running, spam. Skill priority, Carve stacks, Flurry for the set bonus, Stampede, Foe, Trap, Claw, Breath, Rending, Consuming. In case it's not clear, Flurry is the base morph of Bloodthirst and Rapid Strike, so it's either of those two depending on what you run. Molten Whip is just for the passive damage multiplier on your back bar. two-handed and stave. This setup is also pretty decent since a long time, but it's been a bit more popular in the last few patches. It's still not the strongest combination you could pick, but it's something different to the more traditional setups, and it still puts decent enough numbers. In this we move the Maelstrom two-handed from our back bar to our front bar, and use the Maelstrom Inferno on our back bar. In combination with Wrecking Blow, we add a lot of damage to our light attacks, so make sure you have good weaving on that one, which is sadly not that easy since Wrecking Blow is a cast time ability, which is sometimes a bit tricky to weave, especially with some server lags or something. Important notes. Elemental blockade gets off your spell damage, so the damage from the skill on its own won't be that high. However, the Maelstrom staff adds nice damage to your light attacks, and it helps with sustain. Using whip as your spammable is most likely very hard to sustain, since we have eruption, wall, and flames, but yeah, you can try it if you want. Rotation. Rotation is, as always, fully dynamic. Pre-buff, 3 times foe, barb trap. Begin with wall, eruption, claw, wrecking blow, carve, stampede, carve, standard. In my parse I used wrecking blow in between, but you can skip that one. After that, just reapply all dots as they run out. If all dots are running, spam. Skill priority, carve stacks, block it, stampede, foe, trap, claw, breath, eruption, standard. Switch to executioner instead of wrecking blow at roughly 30% boss HP and drop eruption at 20. And don't recast claw or breath in execute if you don't get the full duration out of it, cause then just spamming executioner will be more damage. Molten Whip is just as a passive weapon damage multiplier on our back bar. bow setup. I am not a fan of a bow setup on a dummy since it feels very clunky to play, but I try to get some decent numbers. In this setup we use the Black Rose Prison bow on our front bar, which requires us to manage the distance between us and the enemy, so that can be a little bit annoying since we want to run claw and trap, but the damage from the set is strong, so it's really worth it. I actually prefer a bow setup in some dungeon and arena content, but in those I don't use the Black Rose Prison bow, since this is really only worth the trouble on raid bosses in my opinion. Important notes. The Black Rose bow turns Magnum Shot into a strong damage over time. The dot lasts longer the further you are away from your enemy while that skill lands, and it takes the hitbox middle, so it is nice on dragons or the assembly general, but harder on smaller bosses. You can't bar swap that cast, so the Magnum needs to hit while you are on your Black Rose Prison bow bar. The dot damage depends on the initial hit damage, so even though the proc itself can't crit, it still benefits from crit chance, since if your base skill crits, the dot is higher as well. And you need to dance around a bit with that skill and your melee dots, but yeah, you will figure it out. Rotation. The rotation is, as always, fully dynamic. Pre-buff, Noxious Breath or Faith of Oblivion 3 times, Barb Trap. Begin with Endless Hail, Breath, Injection, Magnum Shot, Standard, Eruption, Claw. After that, just reapply all dots as they run out. If all dots are running, spam. Skill priority, Magnum Shot, Endless Hail, Foe, Trap, Claw, Injection, Breath, Eruption. Molten Whip is just on the back bar to get the passive weapon damage multiplier. trash setups. In trash setups for raids you kinda only want AoE damage abilities, and you can use whatever weapon combination you like. I recommend to use Killed in trash fights if you run Killed on bosses as well, to get some stacks going before you enter the boss fight already. I'd always slot Camo Hunter to get that free minor berserk and 3% weapon damage. Shooting Star is a nice ultimate for nice stacked pots, since you get a lot of ultimate back the more people you hit. Multimap is once again nice for your backbar to get some free weapon damage. Example setup 1. 2H. On the front bar we use Carve as the main spammable, Executioner to finish off some leftover ads, have Camo Hunter for the minor berserk. On the backbar we have Arrow Barrage to get the cliff proccing, we have Channeled Acceleration to pre-buff the minor force, and Whip as weapon damage multiplier. Then we use the Shooting Star on the backbar as main ult, we have Dawnbreaker on the front bar, so we can sometimes use that one or just have it for the passive weapon damage. Then I have Silver Shards on the front bar to get the weapon damage, or maybe sometimes even pull an add-in if it's out of reach for the tanks, and Stampede as strong damage over time. On the back bar, Flames of Oblivion as strong pre-buff dot, basically dot, and Noxious Breath to get some more Seething Fury stacks. Example setup 2, Bow. On the main bar we use Acid Spray as main spammable, and to finish off we use Lethal Arrow. Then we once again have Silver Shards and Ring of Preservation for weapon damage, minor berserk from Camo Hunter, Dawnbreaker, and the back bar is basically the same as on the first setup. Example gear you could use would be, for example, Solxan on your front bar with Valid Ref Monster set, Harpooner's Killed and Arena Bow back bar with 4-piece New Moon, or Solxan on your front bar with Harpooner's Killed, Arena Weapon back, and 5-piece Dagon Body with 1-piece Crit. But there's a lot of options, so just check a bit around what people are running. There are a lot of options.
Watch out!
You're already dead. The only person who is dead is your team.
Fight! Now!
Arena and dungeon examples. Dragoknights don't have access to a proper passive healing income, so we kinda need to use Vigor, since Cauterize is a bad skill and would require us to drop Flames of Oblivion. Dragoknights also don't really benefit from their sustained passives in solo play, since we don't really poison enemies a lot of times. And we also kinda save up on our ultimate for some boss fights or something, so yeah, the sustain could be better. DK's burst damage is not insane, since we have a good mix between damage over time and direct damage, but it ramps up quite fast, so after a couple of seconds we have good damage going. You would want to use either the Stone Giant or Eruption to have access to the minor brutality, and this is obviously only if you're solo or no other DK in your group is providing it. Use whatever weapons you like, all are viable and have benefits in different situations, so just pick whatever you like and build something out of it. Make sure to have Camo Hunter slotted in solo play for the 3 minor berserk and 3% weapon damage. For solo, you either want to have the Shadow or the Lava Mundus to either synergize with stuff like Acuity or reach your pen cap. How do I set up my bars? Please note that neither of the arena or dungeon sets are considered best in slot. Those are just examples to show an idea of how you could set up your bars. In my example, I followed a rule of stuff I want to have. Those are a heal if needed, Camo Hunter, minor force, minor brutality from Stone Giant or Eruption, a backbar main skill, which will proc my glyph all the time, and a spammable on my front bar. After I have all those, I see what I want to achieve with the certain setup, and I will check what skills fit into that. For example, Flames of Oblivion is a very strong cleave damage ability that I can pre-buff, so I kinda always slot it. And for Arena, it's nice to stick and burn, so I slot Silver Leash and Razor Caltrops to AoE nuke a bit, in combination with Whirling Blades to finish them off. For bosses, I just slot strong damage abilities and I'm fine. Example gear would be Sulxan, Leviathan, Mechanical Acuity, War Machine, Vicious Ophidian, Briarheart, and so on. There are a lot of decent alternatives, so just decide what you want to achieve and see what could fit your gameplay.